If you have been here for the last couple of weeks, you're probably expecting to hear the final sermon in our series, Simple Church. But I want to bring a different teaching this morning. I'm going to give the last message in that series at the 11 o'clock sermon, the 11 o'clock service. And for the very first time in my whole career as a pastor, I did two different messages for one Sunday. Because I think I've got some things that will be very helpful for you this morning. If you've been around, the whole point of the Simple Church series that we've been doing in the traditional service is about the importance of simplifying our ministries so that we can focus on the mission of Jesus and offer a very simple step-by-step process that everyone can follow and experience spiritual transformation. And understood in this way, the whole idea of simple is very good. It's something that we're pursuing. But there is another way of understanding the idea of simple, which is not good. And that's the practice of oversimplifying complex issues in life in hopes of getting easy answers. And I believe that this is at the root or at the heart of many, many problems in our society. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning. Now, I want to be honest up front, this teaching is not entirely original to me. This week, I was driving to Vero Beach for a district committee meeting, and I listened to an episode of the Robcast called The Simple and the Subtle, and most of the insights this morning come out of that teaching. But it was so powerful for me that I really wanted to share it with you. And so I want to start in the book of Proverbs, chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. And this is what it says in this passage. Wisdom has built her house. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her servants, and she calls from the highest point of the city, "Let all who are simple come to my house. Let those who have no sense," she says, "come eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways, and you will live. Walk in the way of insight." And what's interesting here is that in this passage, God's wisdom is portrayed as a woman, and this woman is calling a feast. "Let those who are simple come to my house and feast." And the reason why Lady Wisdom is calling a feast is because she knows that there is more than enough wisdom to go around. And so all those who are searching for wisdom in their lives, if they will come to this feast, they will get more than what they need. And I believe that if we have ears to hear and eyes to see, that this passage has the power to speak to those of us who find ourselves in a tight spot. Have you ever been in a tight spot? You face a very complex, difficult issue. You lay out the pros and the cons, but still, despite your best efforts, it's difficult to find the way forward. So, if that is where you are this morning, I want to encourage you by saying that there is a wisdom tradition that is over 1,000 years old that can help you. As I mentioned, the verse that we just read is from the book of Proverbs, and the Hebrew word for proverb is masal, and it literally means a comparison. And so Proverbs reveals that there's more than one way to see the world, to live in the world, more than one way of being in the world, to be oriented in our life. And the way that it shows us this is by offering various comparisons and then inviting us to choose the way of wisdom. Now, given all of these comparisons, one set comes up over and over and over again, and that is the comparison between the simple and the prudent. Now, for many people today, the word prudent is an odd word. I'm sure that many of you have heard the word, but I'm also assuming that you're not walking around using it all the time. So if someone says, hey, let's go surfing today and it's raining, I don't suppose you're saying, well, that wouldn't be prudent, right? I mean, it's not a word that we typically use. It's an odd word. And if someone asks you to give a crisp definition, you might find it difficult. In stark contrast, everybody thinks that they understand what the word simple means. And most of the time when they use the word simple, it has positive connotations. But as I mentioned just a moment ago, in the book of Proverbs, what's surprising is that the word simple doesn't have a positive connotation, it has a negative connotation. In other words, the author of the book of Proverbs is saying, you don't want to follow the way of the simple. This is a way of being in the world that you want to turn away from, because if you follow that path, it is self-destructive. So, because the author of the book of Proverbs is using a strange word that we're not familiar with, and a word that we already think we know the meaning of, but maybe don't, it's important for us from the very beginning, if we're going to understand this passage, if we're going to understand the main point the author's trying to make, is to get clear about precisely how these words are being used. And what is absolutely fascinating to me, you ready? What is fascinating to me is that the Hebrew root word for simple is a reference to people who are easily seduced. I just want to say that again because it's powerful. The simple are easily seduced. The simple are those who do not have a larger moral compass. They don't have a higher point of view. They don't have the ability to see below the surface of appearances, and therefore they're easily seduced by things like money and sex and applause and power and influence. And perhaps most importantly, the simple are seduced by easy answers. The simple are seduced by easy answers. They are quick to believe the first thing that they hear, and so they can be described as naive, gullible, or even intellectually lazy. According to the author of Proverbs, those who are simple don't reflect on the depth, the significance, or the complexity of real life. And the author goes on to say in the book of Proverbs that the simple inherit folly, which is to say that they're handed a belief system or a set of rules or an ideology, and they don't reflect on it. They just accept it as absolute truth, and they're off to the races, often parroting or just rehearsing what they've heard from others. So they don't examine, reflect, question, or wrestle with ideas. They just grab it and run with it. Also, the simple are very easily triggered by negative feelings, and they tend to compulsively overreact. They don't have appropriate boundaries, so when they have bad feelings, they can't keep them in long enough to process them and then make a decision about how they're going to express those bad feelings and move forward with wisdom and soul and kindness. And so they lack self-control. Now, if I were to kind of summarize this definition of the simple, we could say that the simple are the foolish. They are those that lack wisdom. In contrast, prudent. The prudent see things from a higher altitude, and they're capable of plumbing the depths of the situation. They can understand the complexities. They can respond with wisdom and grace and soul. You guys know what I mean when I talk about soul? Have you ever met a soul surfer? It's someone who's not doing it for the applause or the sponsorships. They're doing it because it's part of who they are. And so people with wisdom, they can look at all the complexities and they can make wise decisions with soul and with grace. In fact, the Hebrew word for prudence, which was a surprise to me as well, the Hebrew word for prudence can be translated as subtlety and nuance. So, if being simple is the problem, at least as it was just described, then Lady Wisdom has the cure: prudence. She gives subtlety to the naive. Isn't that interesting? Lady Wisdom gives subtlety to the naive. So, while the simple are easily seduced because they live on the surface and they're focusing on appearances, while they're easily seduced, the prudent, the wise, they are grounded. And they're harder to pull off track because they see below the surface and they can wrestle with complexity, ambiguity, and nuance. And what's often discouraging to me is that we live in a culture that worships at the altar of the simple. They want easy answers. They want fast response. If you can grasp it, love it, hate it, make fun of it, share it, Instagram it, Snapchat it, repost it in 10 seconds, and it must be great. Because we want the fast, the instant, results in the immediate gratification. This is true in many areas of life. Just think about how most of us get our news these days. We want our news to come through our social media feeds in simple headlines, short blog posts, or 3-minute videos. And this is one reason why it's so easy for us to accept news stories in cyberspace that simply aren't true. We don't have time for books and lengthy articles. We don't want to check the credibility of our sources or even think critically about the content that we're consuming. Our desire for the simple and the quick, our impatience with deep thinking, and the strength of our own confirmation bias makes us hungry for memes, hungry for tweets, hungry for short sound bites and videos. We want something that we can quickly grasp and then make a snap decision. This is good, this is bad. This is right, this is wrong. This is the side that I stand on. This is the inside. And this is the side that you stand on. And it's the outside. And this is just one manifestation of what the author of Proverbs is calling the simple way. But there are also examples in business and commerce. If you haven't realized this by now, advertisers have one goal, and that is to convince you that you need something so that you will very quickly buy it. And so, advertisers are not going to encourage you to ask deep questions. In fact, they're going to discourage you from asking questions like, is this actually good for me? Is it good for others? Is it good for the environment? Is the person who produced this good or service, are they being paid a living wage and being treated fairly? Advertisers don't want you to ask those questions and to get into complexity. They want to quite simply tell you, you need it, now buy it. Another example is religion. Think about how many pastors have said to you, this is the way it is. And if you don't agree with them, or if you struggle and wrestle with doubt, then you're kicked out of the tent. There's simply no room for questioning and doubting and wrestling with ambiguity. And you know, sometimes families operate in this way. You know what I'm talking about? There's a set of unspoken rules that everybody has to abide by. And there are some things that you're allowed to talk about, and there are other things you're not allowed to talk about. And if you start asking a lot of questions and digging below the surface, trying to discover some of the causes of the dysfunction that you experience, then the gatekeepers in the family will say, shh, we don't talk about that. And if you keep talking, sometimes in passive-aggressive and sometimes in aggressive ways, you will be shamed. Because you're not supposed to go deep. Keep it simple and stay on the surface. Another way of understanding those who are simple is that they love yes or no answers that create a litmus test for inclusion. And religion is another great example of this. Sometimes religion is reduced to a list of hot-button, politically charged claims to which we must quickly say yes or be rejected. I think that this is bad religion. They start with theological, moral, or political claims. They create a checklist, and then they quiz you. Right? They quiz you. Do you believe this? Yep. Okay. Check. Do you believe that? Okay. Yep. Check. Where do you come down on this issue? Do you agree with me on this issue? Yep, check. And if you can quickly say yes, 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 without any hesitation, without any struggle, without any reflection or thought, then they certify you as a real Christian. Hooray! And then they include you in the fellowship of believers, and they say, now we can be friends. But if you doubt, and I'm not even talking about saying, well, no, I don't agree with that. I'm just talking about if you were to say to them, you know what, I struggle with this issue. I haven't figured it out yet. Or if you say to them, this question is too big to be reduced to a simple yes or no answer, then all of a sudden you're viewed with suspicion. And you can see the wheels start turning. And then they ask a couple follow-up questions. And if you quickly get on board, and you don't argue, and you don't wrestle, and you don't doubt, if you quickly get on board, then they'll say, oh, they're okay, I can be friends with them. But if you don't get on board, then oftentimes they quietly and not so quietly will reject you and shun you. And say, I got to stay away from that person. And God forbid you have the audacity to say, you know what, brother, you know what, sister, I think you're wrong on that issue. Because then you will be viewed as dangerous, as a possible corrupter of the faith and as an enemy of the church. What's interesting is that this kind of litmus test for inclusion or exclusion, it's not just in the church, it's in all areas of life. Not the least, my friends, in politics. But then we hear a different voice calling in the distance. We hear a different voice. Lady Wisdom says, let the naive be given subtlety. Let those who are living on the surface come and swim in the deep waters. I want to talk to those here this morning who are wrestling with guilt or shame because you're wrestling with an issue and everybody in your life thinks that you should have had it all figured out by now. We're dealing with some pretty difficult issues in the United Methodist Church. And there are people who are wrestling, they're really wrestling, and they're talking, and they're saying, what do? We want the church to stay united, but we've got some challenging issues. And there are people on both sides, the right and the left, who are saying, why are you guys still talking about this? You should have it all figured out by now. And then the people who are wrestling in the middle feel guilty. Have you ever felt that way? Maybe you're hearing the voice of your parents, or your partner, your girlfriend or boyfriend. Maybe you're hearing the voice of your religion. Maybe you're hearing the internal dialogue of the chatterbox. Wherever it's coming from, you feel guilty for not having it all figured out, for not being able to give short yes or no answers and then quickly move on with your life. And you keep beating yourself up because you struggle to figure things out in your business, in your marriage, in your relationship with your kids. You're struggling to figure it out in your politics and in your religion. You've tried to isolate the problems. You've listed out all the pros and cons, thinking if you could just get clear on that, then it would be easy to find a way forward. But then you realize, I'm still stuck. I don't know what to do. You're doing your best to carefully think things through and move forward with integrity and soul and kindness. But you're constantly tempted or shamed with the simple. I'm here to tell you, my friends, there is nothing wrong with you. That's what the title of the message should have been. There's nothing wrong with you. You know, life is complex, and you are doing the right thing by wrestling with the issue and giving it the appropriate weight and the appropriate reflection. So, the stress that you feel, the pressure from the outside, is not because you're doing something wrong. It's precisely because you're doing something right. You are wrestling with the issues, paying attention to the depth and the subtlety, the nuance and the complexity of real life. And my friends, this is the way to wisdom. This is the way to prudence. Being prudent means being honest about all the different aspects at play in any given situation. The way to wisdom is not pretending that everything is simple and that we have all the answers. Anybody who tells you they have all the answers, whether they're a preacher or a politician or a family member, you need to have a red flag go up. Because I don't believe that any of us have it all figured out. We're all in process. The way to wisdom is not around complexity, it's through it. The simple ignore the complexity. They shout the party line. They rehearse the same old Bible verses that already confirm what they believe. They repeat the cliche. They defend the talking points. They stay on the surface. And they oversimplify and just uncritically rehearse what everybody else expects them to say. And do you know why? Because they don't want to be rejected. They don't want the communities that they're involved in and the people that they love to say, well, if you believe that, you are no longer an insider. Let me tell you something, my friends. Anybody who disowns you because you have a difference of opinion on something or because you're wrestling with an issue, that's not real, strong, agape Christian love. And I'm not saying walk away from the relationship, but what I'm saying is there needs to be some work there. I did my PhD work in systematic theology, and one of the greatest lessons I ever learned is that no one gets to heaven on their theology. I'm off topic here and we got to really hurry, but one of my favorite theologians is Karl Barth, and he wrote this humongous volume, multiple volume collection called The Church Dogmatics, and it was heralded as one of the greatest works of Christian theology in the last, within the last 2,000 years. He is a huge name. And he said that he had a vision, that he was walking to heaven, and he had all of his theology books in a wheelbarrow, and as he approached the pearly gates, the angels were laughing at him. Got to get back on topic. But prudence calls us to the deep waters, to learn how to float and swim in complexity, ambiguity, subtlety, and nuance, to relax into the mystery of the world which is God, so that you can become truly wise and make good decisions. However, because we live in a culture that worships at the altar of the simple, when you decide to swim in the deep end, it's going to create tension and even conflict in your life. As you dig deep and ask questions and wrestle with complexity, try to give the proper weight to your decisions, people are going to tell you, stop stirring the pot. Don't talk about that. Just get on board and let's move forward together. Stop doubting and questioning. Religious people are notorious for saying, just have faith. And if someone's saying don't think about this, just have faith, they are grossly distorting what the Bible means by faith, because faith in the Bible includes doubt. And so, some will even suggest that you're weak. You're a weak waffler. You don't have a spine. You can't take a stand on anything. And you need to remember when people tell you that, it's not true. Because the Bible says in Proverbs to abandon the ways of the simple, to stop living on the surface, and to go into the deep waters to really wrestle with the decisions of life. Don't just rehearse another cliche. Don't give another talking point. My goodness, we've heard too many of those. Has anybody gotten to the point where if you hear another talking point on a news channel or another cliche from a pastor, you're just going to vomit? I mean, it's just old and worn out. What you are trying to do as you're wrestling with complexity is you're trying to make important decisions about complex issues to create a life that makes sense to you. That's what God's calling you to do. So wrestle. And it's also important to remember that leaving the simple can be painful. You know, we can become comfortable with our catchphrases and our cliches and our life verses, right? All Christians get a life verse and repeat it all the time. We can get really comfortable with the cliches and the talking points. And you know, at one point in our life, that stuff really helps us and it really works. But then you're going to have some life experiences that are going to break you open like a plastic Easter egg. And sometimes what you're going to find is there's nothing inside. And it's going to hurt. And you're going to experience loss and grief until you can return to God in prayer and rebuild something new that actually works according to your own experience. And so keep wrestling. Keep wrestling. Stay in the deep end. Tolerate the discomfort. Wrestle with the complexity and the nuance and the subtlety and the ambiguity. Give it proper time and weight and consideration so you can make thoughtful and wise decisions.